Ethan had never imagined that diplomacy could be this dangerous. He had been sent from Earth as a representative to the Valari Empire with strict orders to maintain peace between the two civilizations. The Valari were tall and elegant with silver skin that shimmered under their planet's twin suns and eyes that glowed faintly in the dim halls of their crystal palaces. They moved with a grace that made every human seem clumsy in comparison, and their Queen Lyra was the most striking of them all. Her presence commanded silence and respect from all who stood before her. Day had started with celebration. The great ceremonial hall of the Valari Palace was alive with music unlike anything had ever heard. It was made of chimes and deep resonant tones that seemed to hum through the floor and into his bones. The hall itself was a marvel with towering arches of translucent stone and banners of woven light that shifted color with every movement. The air smelled faintly of sweet metallic flowers brought in from the royal gardens. The gathering was meant to mark the signing of a new trade agreement between Earth and the Valari Empire, a fragile treaty that had taken years to arrange, and one wrong word or act could shatter it in an instant. Ethan had been standing near the front beside other diplomats when Queen Lyra entered. Her long robe swept behind her like a river of starlight, and her crown of curved crystal caught the sunbeams that spilled from the high windows. The Valari bowed low while the humans inclined their heads in respect. Ethan felt a mix of awe and nervousness. He had met her once before during negotiations, but this was the first time he had seen her in full ceremonial regalia. She looked less like a politician and more like a figure from a legend. As she reached the center of the hall, the music softened, and the head of the Valari Council began to speak. Ethan tried to focus on the words, though the alien language still felt strange in his ears. It was then that movement in the crowd caught his attention. A shadow flickered behind one of the tall pillars. Something in the way it moved made his skin prickle. A figure stepped out quickly and in the same instant raised an arm in his hand was a long bow, not the kind used for sport or ceremony, but a weapon built for killing. The bowstring snapped and a black arrow streaked through the air. All happened in the space of a breath. Ethan saw the arrow aimed directly at the Queen's chest. His mind screamed to act before his body even understood why. Without thinking, he lunged forward, shoving past two startled Valari guards. He threw himself in front of Queen Lyra, and the poisoned arrow struck his shoulder with a sickening impact. The force spun him slightly, but he stayed on his feet for a moment before the world tilted and he fell to one knee. The crowd erupted in shouts and cries. Guards rushed to surround the queen while others charged at the attacker. The figure tried to flee but was quickly brought down by a barrage of energy nets that crackled in the air. The music had stopped, and the hall now rang with the sound of confusion. Ethan could hear voices shouting in the Valari tongue, some ordering the medics, some cursing the attacker. He felt a burning pain spreading from his shoulder down into his arm and chest. His vision blurred, but he could still make out the queen turning toward him. Her glowing eyes were wide, not with fear, but with something he could not quite name. Strong hands gripped him and lifted him from the ground. The Valari medics moved quickly, speaking in urgent tones as they carried him toward a side passage. He caught glimpses of the hall's ceiling shifting above him and the banners of light now rippling as though disturbed by a wind. He tried to ask if the queen was safe, but his voice came out as a weak rasp. One of the medics nodded, though their expression told him that the situation was far from over. They brought him into a smaller chamber where the walls glowed faintly blue. A table of smooth white crystal stood in the center, and they laid him upon it. Instruments of strange design hovered above him, their edges gleaming. The medics worked with swift precision, cutting away his jacket to expose the wound. The arrow had been removed, but a thin black line spread outward from the puncture, crawling across his skin like ink in water. One of the medics said something sharp, and another brought a vial of bright green liquid. Ethan felt the sting as the antidote entered his veins. The pain in his shoulder flared and then dulled into a heavy throb. His thoughts began to drift, but he forced his eyes open when he sensed a presence beside him. Queen Lyra stood there, her robe still flowing, her crown still in place, but there was no trace of ceremony in her face. She was studying him closely, her eyes catching the light as she spoke softly. Her words were slow and careful, as though she wanted to be sure he understood. She told him that the arrow's poison had been designed to kill a Valari in moments, and the fact that he still breathed was a miracle. She then said something that made his mind swim even more. She told him that in Valari, tradition to save the life of the monarch was to bind one's fate to theirs for life. It was not merely gratitude but an unbreakable vow, and such a vow had only one proper conclusion. Ethan did not fully grasp her meaning at first, but then her final words reached him clear as any translation. She said she would not let his act go unanswered, and that he would be her chosen consort. World tilted again as the antidote pulled him into a deep, restless sleep, and the last thing he saw before darkness closed in was the Queen's gaze, steady and unshaken, as though she had already decided his future without waiting for his answer. When Ethan woke again, the light in the room had changed. The pale blue glow of the walls had softened into a warmer gold, and the air carried a faint scent of herbs. He felt heavy, as though his body belonged to someone else. His shoulders still throbbed, but the sharp burning pain had dulled into a deep ache. He tried to move, but a smooth metallic voice near his head advised him to stay still. It belonged to one of the Valari medics, a tall figure with long silver hair pulled back in a braid. Their hands moved with calm precision as they checked the flow of a translucent fluid from a narrow tube into his arm. Ethan asked weakly how long he had been asleep. The medic told him it had been 2 full rotations of their planet's smaller sun, and that his survival was a matter of astonishment, even among their most skilled healers. The poison, they explained, was crafted to end the life of a Valari warrior before they could take 3 more breaths. It attacked the nervous system and shut down the heart with brutal speed. In his case, the foreign chemistry of his human body had slowed the process, but not enough to make it safe. Without the antidote, he would have been dead within minutes. They told him the antidote was not meant for human use and might still cause unpredictable effects for days or weeks. Before Ethan could ask more, the chamber doors opened and Queen Lyra entered. She was dressed not in ceremonial robes, but in a simple flowing garment of pale silver that caught the golden light in soft ripples. Her crown was absent, but she still carried herself with the same unshakable authority. The medics bowed low before stepping aside to give her space. She came to stand beside his bed and for a moment simply looked at him as if measuring something unseen. Her voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the weight in her words. She told him that Valari law recognized what had happened in the hall, not just as an act of bravery, but as the forging of a life bond. It was an ancient code older than the empire itself. In the eyes of her people, when one risked their life to save the sovereign, they became bound to them until death. The bond was not symbolic. It carried obligations and protections on both sides, and in almost every case it ended in union. The last time such a bond had been formed, she said, was over 1,000 years ago, and it had altered the history of their world. Ethan tried to find the right words to respond, but his mind felt slow and his tongue heavy. The thought of marriage to an alien queen was not something his diplomatic training had prepared him for. He asked why such a tradition still mattered in a time of interstellar alliances and advanced law. The faintest smile touched her lips, and she told him that while the Valari embraced progress, they never abandoned the roots that had shaped them. In their view, honor was not something to be rewritten every century. It was to be carried forward unchanged. He could see now that this was not a request but a declaration. She had already decided what his role would be, and the only thing left was for him to accept or refuse. Yet refusing might be impossible for more than one reason. Even if the Valori permitted him to walk away, it would be seen as an insult of the highest order. It could undo years of peace talks and trade negotiations. It could even spark hostility between their worlds. The more he thought about it, The more he saw how carefully the strands of this situation had woven themselves around him, Lyra's gaze softened as she reached to place a hand lightly over his uninjured arm. She told him that she did not make this choice lightly. She understood that he had acted on instinct, not calculation. Yet that only made it more meaningful to her. People acted with courage when they had time to prepare, but true bravery was to act without thinking of oneself. She said that when she saw him fall before her, she knew his spirit was one she could trust above all others. Ethan listened and felt the weight of her words settle into him. There was something in her tone that was not just royal duty, but something personal. He thought back to the moment in the hall, the flash of the arrow, the burning pain, the look in her eyes after he had been struck. He realized that perhaps this was not merely politics for her. She might truly feel bound to him in a way that went beyond law. Over the next hours, she remained in the chamber, speaking with him about the Valari world. She told him of their history, the wars that had nearly destroyed them, and the pacts that had saved them. She spoke of the twin suns that shaped their seasons, and the great crystal forests where light and wind sang together. Ethan found himself drawn into her descriptions, picturing the places she spoke of, almost as if he had seen them himself. When she finally left, the medics returned to tend to him and bring a meal, a shimmering liquid in a carved glass that tasted faintly of citrus and spice, and a plate of thin bread folded around a soft, fragrant filling. They told him the food was chosen to match human digestion as closely as possible. He ate slowly, still trying to process everything he had heard later that night, or whatever passed for night under the soft golden light. Ethan lay awake, staring at the faint ripples in the glowing walls. He knew his life had changed in a way that could never be reversed. Whether he agreed or not, he was now tied to the most powerful figure in the Valari Empire. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. He felt a pull toward her, not just because of the bond she claimed, but because in the short time he had spoken with her, he had sensed a depth of will and intelligence that demanded respect. Somewhere deep inside, he wondered if perhaps his leap in front of the arrow had been more than reflex. Maybe a part of him had known even then that this was a path he was meant to take, a path that would lead him far from the life he had imagined, but perhaps towards something greater than he had ever dared to hope. The days that followed moved in a strange rhythm for Ethan. His wound healed slowly under the care of Valari medicine, and he was moved from the medical chamber to a private residence within the royal palace. The quarters were unlike anything he had ever seen, a suite of rooms built from smooth crystal walls that shifted colors with the light, and balconies that overlooked a vast city of shimmering towers and floating gardens. The air was always warm, but never stifling, and faint music seemed to drift through the halls at all hours, carried on unseen currents. From the moment he arrived, there was no doubt he was under constant watch. Guards in silver armor stood at each entrance, their faces hidden behind mirrored visors. They moved with perfect silence. Yet he could feel their eyes on him, even when he walked in the gardens or along the palace corridors. He knew they were only a few steps away. Queen Lyra had told him that it was for his protection, but Ethan suspected there was more to it than that. He was not just a guest. He was the human who had saved their queen, and in the eyes of some, perhaps an intruder in their sacred traditions. Palace itself was alive with whispers. News of the attack had spread far beyond the capital, and the story of the human who had taken the poisoned arrow was told in markets and taverns across the empire. The people were divided. Some saw Ethan as a hero whose courage had preserved their ruler. Others saw him as an outsider whose sudden closeness to the queen threatened the balance of their world. In the council chambers, these divisions were sharper still. Certain factions had begun to argue that the queen's bond to a human would weaken Valari rule, that it would set a dangerous precedent, and encourage other species to push for influence over the throne. Lyra seemed unmoved by such talk. Whenever Ethan saw her in the council hall, she carried herself with the same calm authority as always, yet he noticed the small signs of strain in her eyes and the way her voice tightened when certain council members spoke. It became clear to him that her decision to honor the life bond was not a matter of convenience. It was a risk, one she was willing to take, but a risk all the same for Ethan. Life in the palace was both a cage and a wonder. He began to learn the Valari language with the help of a patient tutor named Rallin, who spoke slowly and used gestures to bridge the gaps between words. At first Ethan struggled, but soon he found himself able to understand fragments of conversations in the corridors and gardens. Sometimes he caught mentions of his name spoken with admiration, other times with suspicion. His time with Lyra grew more frequent. She would summon him to walk with her through the crystal gardens where plants glowed faintly in the twilight, and the air was filled with drifting motes of light that clung to their hair and clothes. She told him stories of past rulers and the challenges they had faced. He told her of Earth, its seas and forests and skies filled with countless stars. Lyra listened with the curiosity of someone who had traveled far, yet still found new wonders in another's words. Despite the growing familiarity, there were moments when Ethan felt the invisible line between them, the weight of her title and the expectations that came with it. He began to wonder whether her interest in him was truly personal, or if it was bound entirely to the tradition she had spoken of. Yet when she laughed at one of his clumsy attempts to speak her language, or when her gaze lingered a moment too long, he felt there might be something more beneath the surface. The first attempt on his life came in the palace gardens at dusk. Ethan had been walking alone under the watch of 2 guards when he heard a faint hum in the air. Alone under the watch of 2 guards, when he heard a faint hum in the air. A sudden flash of movement came from the shadows between the glowing trees, and an object like a thin blade of energy sliced through the space where his head had been a moment before. The guards reacted instantly, their weapons flaring as they drove the attacker back into the darkness. The assailant vanished, leaving only a faint scorch mark on the smooth crystal path. Lyra came to see him within minutes. She did not ask if he was hurt, because she could see he was unharmed. Instead, she stood close, her voice low and steady as she told him that there were those in her court who would stop at nothing to break the bond between them. She said that as long as he remained by her side, he would be in danger, and that danger would only grow if he accepted the path she had laid before him. He could walk away now, she told him, but if he stayed, he would have to be prepared to fight not just for his life, but for the future they might share. Ethan felt the weight of the choice pressing in on him. He knew he could ask to return to Earth. The Valari would not imprison him. Yet the thought of leaving felt wrong. He had faced danger before, but never with stakes like these. This was no longer just about his own survival. It was about the fragile thread connecting 2 civilizations, and the trust of someone who had risked her own, standing to protect him. Over the next few days, the palace tightened its security guards, doubled their watch, and Ethan was rarely left alone. Lyra's council grew more divided, with some openly calling for the bond to be annulled. Rumors swirled that the original assassin had not acted alone, and that a larger conspiracy was at work. Ethan found himself watching every shadow, every reflection in the crystal walls, wondering where the next strike might come from. One evening, Lyra invited him to a private dining chamber high in the eastern tower. From the balcony, they could see the city stretching to the horizon, its towers lit with drifting strands of light like rivers in the air. She spoke little at first, letting the silence settle before finally telling him that she believed the threats against them would not stop until the bond was formalized. She said that once the vow was sealed by their ancient rite, even the strongest voices in her council would be forced to accept it. Her eyes held his steadily as she asked if he was ready for such a step. Ethan did not answer immediately. The thought of binding his life to hers in a way that could never be undone filled him with both fear and a strange exhilaration. He knew that accepting meant stepping into a world of constant danger and responsibility, but it also meant stepping toward something that felt undeniably important. As he stood there with the alien city glowing beneath them, he began to realize that his choice would shape not just his own fate, but the fate of two worlds. The summons to the Grand Summit arrived on the morning of the third week after the attack. A messenger in white crystal armor delivered a sealed orb to Ethan's quarters. Within it shimmered the invitation written in both the Valari script and a translation into Kofoders. Within it shimmered the invitation written in both the Valari script and a translation into his own language. The meeting would take place in the Hall of Convergence, a place where leaders from allied and rival worlds alike gathered to settle matters that could decide the course of empires. The subject was simple on paper, yet impossible. In truth, the council wished to debate the future of the life bond between Queen Lyra and the human who had taken the poisoned arrow. When Ethan entered the hall later that day, the sight struck him harder than he expected. The chamber rose in sweeping curves like the inside of a great shell, light pouring through narrow slits high above. The seats were arranged in ascending rings, each occupied by a figure of authority. Valari nobles in their gleaming robes, human envoys in dark suits, and even a few representatives of other allied races, whose features were strange and beautiful in equal measure. At the center stood a circular platform where Lyra waited, flanked by her closest advisors. Her expression was calm, yet her eyes carried the sharp focus of a warrior ready for battle. Ethan took his place beside her, feeling the weight of 100 gazes. Some of those eyes regarded him with curiosity, others with open hostility. The head of the Valari Council rose and began to speak in the flowing tones of their language. The poetic language the translation whispered into Ethan's ear through a small device. Every word was measured and deliberate. The council acknowledged his act of bravery, but questioned whether such a bond could be upheld without risking the stability of the empire. They argued that the traditions of their ancestors were meant for Valari alone, and that binding a human to the throne could invite dissent or even rebellion. One by one others spoke. Some supported the bond, calling it a sign of a new era where species could stand as equals. Others feared it would weaken their culture beyond repair. Ethan listened in silence, his hands clasped behind his back, resisting the urge to defend himself too soon. This was not only about him, it was about two civilizations, and the delicate balance between them. When Lyra finally spoke, the hall fell silent. Her voice carried across the chamber without strain, rich and commanding. She spoke not of politics, but of trust. She reminded them that their empire had survived because they honored those who acted with courage, regardless of their origin. She told them that Ethan had not asked for reward or recognition, and that his act had been without calculation. She said that to break the bond would not only dishonor him but dishonor the throne itself. Words stirred murmurs in the crowd, but the debate was far from over. The discussion shifted to the practical dangers of the bond, and the threats it had already attracted. Some members pressed for Ethan to be removed from the palace until the danger passed. Others whispered about exiling him from Valari space altogether. Ethan could feel the tension rising like a storm about to break it. Was then that movement near the upper ring caught his eye. A figure in dark clothing was slipping between the rows, their presence barely noticed by those around them. Ethan's instincts screamed a warning. He turned toward Lyra just as a glint of metal flashed in the light. The assassin moved with speed, drawing a compact weapon shaped like a curved claw. A beam of searing blue energy erupted from it, aimed directly at the queen. Ethan reacted without thought, throwing himself sideways into her path. The beam struck the platform where she had been standing, scorching the crystal in a burst of heat. Guards shouted as chaos erupted. The attacker leapt from the stands, landing on the floor below, and sprinted toward the outer archway. Two guards gave chase while others rushed to shield the queen and Ethan. The hall filled with the roar of voices. Both Valari and human Lyra gripped his arm, steadying him. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the noise around them seemed to fade. She told him that the attack only proved what she already knew: the threats would not stop unless they faced them together. She said the council might argue and the enemies might plot, but once the bond was sealed there would be no doubt about their unity. The meeting was suspended as guards swept the hall searching for signs of other conspirators. Ethan and Lyra were escorted to a secure chamber where only a handful of trusted advisors were allowed. She paced the room, speaking quickly to her aides in their own tongue. Then she turned to Ethan and told him that the council was now split more than ever. Half would vote to honor the bond while the other half would try to block it entirely. The deciding voices could be swayed by the way the two of them responded to the attack. If they appeared shaken, the opposition would claim it as proof that the union was dangerous. If they stood firm, it might convince the undecided that they were stronger together than apart. Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle over him. He knew that his life had already been claimed by forces far beyond his control, yet he also knew that he had a choice in how he would face what came next. He could step back letting fear or doubt guide him, or he could step forward into the storm and claim the role fate had thrown at his feet. When the summit reconvened later that day, Ethan walked beside Lyra onto the central platform. The scorch mark from the failed attack still marred the floor, like a shadow of the danger they had faced. The hall quieted as they stood side by side. Ethan spoke for the first time, addressing the crowd in careful Villari. His words were simple but carried the weight of truth. He said he had not come to their world seeking power or title, that he had acted to save a life, not a throne. He also said that now, having stood beside their queen and seen the strength of her people, he could not in good conscience walk away from the bond that had been formed there. Was a long silence, then voices began to rise from the seats above. Some still opposed him, but others nodded in agreement. The council declared that the final vote would be held in 3 days. Until then, the palace would prepare for the possibility that the union would be formalized. The air in the hall was thick with both hope and tension as Ethan and Lyra left together, their path uncertain, but their steps in unison. The hall was silent except for the steady sound of the alien queen's breathing as she stood before him, her tall frame wrapped in a gown of shimmering fabric that caught the light like liquid gold. Her dark eyes watching him with a strange mixture of pride and concern around them. The gathered crowd of nobles, warriors, and advisors waited in tense anticipation, none of them speaking, for they knew the decision that was about to be made would change not only the fate of one man, but perhaps the future of 2 worlds. Man felt the weight of countless gazes upon him, yet his thoughts were not on the crowd. His mind kept returning to the moment of the attack, the rush of movement, the glint of the poisoned arrow, the cold acceptance that struck him just before he stepped forward to shield her. It had been an act without thought, a pure instinct to protect, and now it had brought him here, in the grand chamber of her people, standing as the one she had chosen to be by her side. She stepped closer, her steps slow and measured, as though she knew each moment would be remembered for generations. Her voice when she spoke was calm yet filled with a quiet strength. She said, "You saved me, not because you were ordered, not because you sought reward, but because you cared for a life, not your own, and such courage cannot be left unanswered." He listened to her words and felt the heaviness of their meaning. The queen's gaze never wavered as she declared before all who were present that she wished for him to stand beside her as her bonded mate, a role that would make him not only her partner, but her equal in ruling her realm. A murmur swept through the crowd, some voices filled with surprise, others with approval, and some with clear discontent, yet none dared to speak against her openly. Had no illusions about what this would mean. The bond was not merely symbolic, it was a merging of 2 lives, 2 duties, and 2 fates. It would tie him to a people who did not fully trust outsiders, and it would place him at the center of politics and power struggles that were foreign to him. Still, he looked at her and saw not just a queen, but the woman he had risked everything for. And in that moment, the choice began to take shape in his mind. She extended her hand to him, her fingers slender yet steady, her expression giving nothing away beyond the expectation that he would answer truly, and without fear he thought of the world he had come from, the familiar skies, the voices of friends, and the quiet life he had once imagined. He thought too of the journey that had brought him here, the battles fought, the dangers faced, and the unexpected bond that had grown between them. Despite the distance between their worlds, slowly he reached for her hand, the gesture simple but filled with meaning, his voice steady as he said, "If this is the path we are to walk, then I will walk it with you." The words hung in the air, and for a brief instant the hall seemed to hold its breath. Then Queen's lips curved in a faint smile, and she tightened her grip on his hand, a quiet affirmation that the bond was now sealed in the eyes of her people. The advisors stepped forward one by one, offering formal blessings and vows of loyalty, though he could sense that not all were sincere. The warriors in the room struck their fists to their chests in salute, their way of showing respect to one who had proven bravery in battle. The ceremony that followed was steeped in tradition, filled with symbols of unity and shared destiny, and though many of its details were unfamiliar to him, he understood its heart, the joining of two paths into one. As the celebration began, the music rising in strange, haunting melodies, he felt the Queen lean closer, her voice low enough that only he could hear. She said, "You may not yet see it, but your presence here will change more than you know, and I will stand with you as you once stood for me." He met her gaze and saw a promise there, one that went beyond politics or ceremony. It was a promise of trust and of shared burdens, no matter the trials ahead. Night stretched on the great hall, filled with the sounds of voices, laughter, and the clinking of ceremonial cups, but beneath it all there was a sense of something larger taking root, a bridge being built between two worlds, not through treaties or armies, but through the courage of one man and the choice of one queen. And though challenges would surely come, there was a feeling in the air that the first step toward a new future had been taken. Later, when the crowds had dispersed and the torches burned low, he stood on the balcony, overlooking the alien city, its spires reaching toward the night sky. The Queen stood beside him, silent. For a time before she spoke, she said, "You could have turned away. You could have let fate take its course, and I would not have blamed you, but you did not, and for that, I will never let you stand alone." He looked out at the horizon and knew that whatever storms came next, he would face them here in this strange world at her side. And so the story of the man who took the poisoned arrow for the alien queen did not end with that single act of sacrifice. It became the beginning of something far greater, a tale that would be told for generations as a reminder that the choices made in moments of danger can shape the destiny of entire worlds, and that sometimes the bond between two souls, no matter how different, can be the force that changes everything. End.